In this nugget, we'll be taking a look at group policy. This will be part 1. We'll start off with just an introduction to group policy objects. Most of the time we'll be working with group policy objects in a domain. However, a big part of our discussion here will be revolving around a local group policy, and I do that because it's part of the exam objectives and it does have a targeted specific use. One of the other things we'll take a look at, which is only available in the more recent versions of Windows, is something called multiple local group policy. Whereas we used to have only a single policy we could use on a local machine, now you can actually use more than one to make specific types of exceptions. Alright folks, I'm proud to announce that my wife and I recently celebrated our anniversary. I think it's 23 or 22, 20 some years of being married. And so we've had a wonderful marriage, but I have to say I was a little bit puzzled by something this year. For my anniversary present, she bought me a book. But the title of the book was 101 Ways to Flatten Your Stomach. I'm not quite sure what to infer from this, other than the obvious. I have a feeling she's gone out and seen too many Matthew McConaughey movies, or Ryan Gosling, or something like that. Hopefully she hasn't snuck out to see, what is that, Magic Mike or something? I'm pretty sure she wouldn't. I hope she wouldn't. Anyway, apparently I'm going to have to get over this Pillsbury Doughboy physique. But I'll tell you one thing, she's got another thing coming if she thinks she can make me do sit-ups. Well, you know what, though? You can make people do certain things, at least in IT. Not in real life, but in IT you kind of can. And how's that? Well, you can use group policy objects. As an administrator, this is pretty much going to give you the ability to control everything that a user can and cannot do on their machine. It's very far-reaching and powerful, and let's get an overview of what it really is. It's really a group of registry settings. Just about any group policy object that you configure, what you're really doing is you're making a registry punch. Group policy is simply a nice UI that explains all of the different settings that you have available to you, so you don't have to memorize obscure registry locations and go and on each individual computer make those changes yourself. Plus, it'd be impractical to do that on everybody's computer. So a group policy object, within literally seconds or maybe a minute, you could go in and make a change that could affect your entire domain or an organizational unit. A group of registry settings is what these really are. That's why we use the word group. It doesn't have anything to do with security groups, though. So you don't want to make the mistake of getting those two mixed up. Now, what are the components of a group policy object? The first thing that you'll have here is a template. And this is similar to what you see with other kinds of applications and so on. If you use Microsoft Word, they have templates there. Templates that allow you to create, I don't know, garage sale flyers, or templates that allow you to create a formal business letter or a resume, that sort of thing. Well, templates here with group policy are really things that populate all that you see in group policy. Now, we've already looked at group policy because we've kind of had to at previous points in this series, and you've seen that as I expand down through computer configuration or user configuration and administrative templates, all of those things. There's various settings, checkboxes, radio buttons, and whatnot. That all comes from what's defined in the templates. And you can also even add more to the default templates that are already there. Let's just get a quick look at what we've got. And in particular, as I go to this other domain, I've got an accusource.local domain over here, which we don't use for most of our demonstrations, but I'm going to show you in this example under user configuration and policies, we have administrative templates. Again, there's thousands of policies throughout all of this stuff by default. But you can add, there's probably hundreds of additional, if not more than 1,000 additional settings you can configure for Microsoft Office. For example, here I went and downloaded some administrative template files from Microsoft relating to Office 2013, and all major releases of Office have these for their respective versions. And you can see here now, for example, under Microsoft Word, I could force people to do certain things. For example, I don't know, maybe I could force them to find things only in Japanese. Wouldn't that be fun? But we could do other things such as configure their review items, the word options, for example, the proofing. Maybe people keep turning off checking the grammar with spelling, and we look like a bunch of idiots because we can't seem to use proper grammar, which is kind of an epidemic in America today. But anyway, so we say, enough of that. We're not going to look like a bunch of idiots. We're going to check our grammar as we go here. And then we would click OK here with that setting. We enable that policy setting and click OK. And now, any place where I link this group policy object, people would be forced to check their grammar as they go along. So that just gives you an idea of additional templates you can add. Some of them will also be from third-party companies, not Microsoft, but Microsoft does offer a lot of templates, especially for Microsoft Office. Now, the group policy objects, as we look at the components here, the group policy object files themselves are in the sysvol. So then, returning to my main domain controller in the nuggetlab.com domain, where we'll be performing, I think, all of our demos for this, I'm going to go to the file system and show you where some of the things are located. First of all, by default, if you just use all the defaults, it's on drive C under Windows, and then Policy Definitions. Okay, this is a very important folder. We'll be taking a look at this a little bit later on, but this is going to give us a common kind of a foundation for all of our templates domain-wide, so we don't have mixed up templates so that there's the same version all the way across. But you can see here there's ADMX files. These are where actually the settings are stored, but they are language independent. So if I had a Japanese version or a Korean version or whatever, then these same ADMX files would still work on those additional languages. Anything that is language specific kind of dovetails into these ADMX files through, you guessed it, this folder right here. And you can see I'm using English US. And then here's these ADML files, which is for language, and they plug into, kind of dovetail into these ADMX files, which we saw earlier. And if I go down here, like to this autoplay, I'm not going to really exhaust this, but just by way of example, you can kind of see some of the settings that are in here. So if I go into Notepad, for example, and we take a look, you kind of have to kind of ply your way through all of this. But there's a policy here with a policy name that says no auto run, for example. And so apparently somewhere in there would be the ability to forcibly enable or disable the ability to use autoplay on your system. And then what we do with these components is once you've created a policy, you link it to an Active Directory organizational unit most of the time. It can also actually be linked to sites or domains. Okay, and then there's also a local policy, which we'll also address later here. There's also specific settings that you can come up with in these policies, and we've looked at those a couple of times in the past, and we'll be looking at some more here as we go along. Now, for the interfaces, how do you actually edit group policy? There's a number of different ways of doing this. First of all, you could use something called the local group policy editor. So, for example, here I'm on a Windows 8 computer, and if I wanted to use the local policy editor, what you would do is you type gpedit.msc, okay? And you can see that there's one that appears right there, and then I'll just click on it. And this would then apply policy only to this one computer. Now, for the most part, that's going to be impractical. For the most part, we want to use group policy objects that are from the domain and that we can link to the site domain or organizational unit. This would only apply to the local machine, whereas on the domain controller, that would apply to a broad scope, an entire domain, an entire site, an entire organizational unit. But this could still be useful if I have a special case with this one computer. I have something that's out of band that I don't want to have configured the same way as all of my other machines. I could go into this machine using gpedit and make some change. The other editing tools that you can use would be the Group Policy Management Console, which is your most common tool to use, and the Group Policy Management Editor, which is also very common to use. Now, when you actually edit a group policy object, most administrators will probably do this using the remote server administration tools on their own local Windows desktop computer from their cubicle. They're not usually putting their hands directly on a server. But even when you use those RSAT tools, what they actually do is connect by default to the domain controller that's known as the Primary Domain Controller Emulator, or PDC Emulator. In my case, I am going to go ahead and do it directly on the domain controller just by nature of the instruction here. And in order to get there, I'm going to go to Tools, and then I'm going to go down to Group Policy Management. And then once we get this open, we can see that we are now connected to that directly. Now, if I wanted to connect to a different domain controller, notice that right here in the first interface, it allows me to change that. I've only got the one domain controller now because I've decommissioned my other ones for simplicity's sake. But if I clicked on change, I could browse for DC Nugget 2, DC Nugget 3, whichever one I had. And that might be more practical if DC Nugget 1 was on the other side of the planet and I had less reliable network connections to it or something like that. Otherwise, by default, we do edit these, if possible, on the PDC emulator because it's kind of the primary source for all policies, and it will then propagate through replication out to my other domain controllers at a future point in time. So anyway, this is the actual tool itself. Now, as I look at this, the way we will normally work with it is we'll browse down through, and very often we can go a couple of different ways. First thing you could do, and this is something we often do, for example, in a classroom environment or an instructional environment, is we'll go directly to the organizational unit that we want to work with and apply a policy to, and we'll right-click to choose Create a GPO in this domain and link it here. However, I want to encourage you in practical administration for your daily group policy editing to not create policies that way, but I would recommend that you go to Group Policy Objects down here, and then you create the policy here. Just right-click there and choose New. Create your policy. Then when you're ready and you're sure that it's got all the configuration settings that you need, then you can link it to one of your organizational units. For example, if this test policy was one that I wanted to link to my Tucson users, I would right-click here and link an existing GPO, and then I'd locate test policy and click OK. Okay. Why do I recommend doing it that way instead of directly right-clicking here? Because if I'm creating a GPO in this domain and I misconfigure something, then immediately it could start to affect my clients and they could be misconfigured. So I will usually create one under Group Policy Objects, and then to make sure that it's all correct, I may actually even ask a friend to check it out as well and say, hey, did I configure this right? Does it look okay to you? Once we get approval, and sometimes some organizations will have a whole approval process for new Group Policy Objects. But once it's approved, then we can link it up there. Also, you can click and drag it. Like that. Are you sure you want to link it? I'm going to say cancel, but you could link it that way as well. Notice also that I do have this test policy. I very often recommend that you just create one that's a test policy. You can name it whatever you want to, but one that I never actually intend to use anywhere. And that's because a lot of times I'll browse through that and I'll be on the search for a policy. I may accidentally enable one, and I don't want to enable that on a live policy that's linked to something that could do some damage. So this is just kind of my browsing around policy here. Then we use the Group Policy Management Editor, or the GPME, which I showed you on the whiteboard, and I would click on Edit here, and then you've seen me work with this before. This is where we actually go down through and look for specific group policies. So let's start small in terms of our policy, because the narrowest scope you can use is the local group policy. Now, this is not something that we use as frequently as I mentioned earlier. However, it is an exam objective, and it does have targeted specific use. So we'll try to be very familiar with it here. One thing to remember, as I said earlier, is it applies only locally. Now, you might spend a lot of time and strategy and planning and everything to configure a whole bunch of settings on one local machine. Maybe it's a specialized file server that you want to have very specific settings on. Well, you might realize that you have another file server that needs a lot of those same settings. Well, rather than having to memorize everything that you clicked on or write it all down on a yellow legal pad, what you can do is take the first group of settings that you configured on that local policy and export them, and then import them to another machine. Now, let's take a look here, though, at a local group policy. If I, first of all, if I go into, let's try to find something here. Let's go to the start, and let's say I wanted to go to Control Panel. Okay, so I'll just type in Control, and then you can see I've got Control Panel right there, and here's all of my settings, and I can make a lot of configuration changes, right? Well, what if on this particular Windows 8 computer, or maybe it's a file server or whatever, we don't want people fiddling around with it. For a Windows 8 machine, this would be a good example of something that we send out to trade shows. Maybe it's a kiosk machine. We don't want people that are, passers-by rechanging everything on the control panel or vandalizing it that way. Or maybe it's a very important file server in the server room, and we don't want other people going up to it and making changes that they shouldn't make either. So let's go down to Administrative Templates and Control Panel. Maybe we want to prohibit access to Control Panel and PC settings. Notice that for Windows 8, this will also remove Control Panel settings from the Start Screen, File Explorer, the Settings Charm, all of those items as well. The explanations here, by the way, are really very good if you're not quite sure what it's going to do. Notice that you can also make comments, and we can say that we want to lock down, kiosk machines. Another thing that a lot of organizations will do on both local policies as well as group policy objects in the domain is they'll say who was responsible for this policy so that we can know who to blame if it fails, right? So I'm going to put somebody's name down here that would be responsible if this was a horribly bad idea. How about Greg Shields created this policy? Okay. You can also then search against all the policies that you have once you go into the domain level, and you can find all policies created by Greg Shields. Okay, there we go. So then we could click OK here, and what we've done is we've enabled the prohibition to control panel and the settings. Now, it may not take place effective immediately. So, for example, if I go back down here and click on Start and Control Panel, then we'll see here that I did take place effective immediately in this case. So it says that I'm restricted, so contact my administrator. What I was going to show you there was if it doesn't seem to take place immediately, you can always go to a command prompt and type GP update, and it should then take effect. Now also remember, for domain policy as well as local group policy, there's two sides of it. There's both the computer configuration, and then there's also the user configuration. The computer configuration on a local group policy applies to everybody regardless of whether you're an administrator or not an administrator, whatever the case may be. Okay, so you do have to bear that in mind. This will always apply to everyone. There's no way to really make exceptions to that. Then there's also user configuration. Now this is also going to apply to everyone unless one of these conditions are true. You can set up local group policy so that it only applies to the members of the local administrator's security group, okay, or non-administrators. Okay, so you can specify whether or not they're a member of that group. So if they're a member of the administrators, then you can have it apply one way. If they're not a member of administrators, then you can have it apply a different way. Also, you can set it up so that a specific user will have some other kind of a policy set up. So maybe we want everything to be set up so that it locks down all users except for a specific user that we might have as a local ad hoc administrator. Maybe my Tucson user 01 account in Tucson is my on-site so-called admin. Or maybe we want them not to be locked down on that specific local group policy. Now, local group policy also can be used on any standalone machine. In other words, one that's not a member of a domain. Or it could be used on anything that is a domain member. Okay, so any domain or non-domain member. The only exception there would be domain controllers. Because of the nature of a domain controller itself, you don't set up local group policies on domain controllers. Okay. Also, the local processing of a local group policy can be disabled via a group policy object in the domain if you want to. This might be the case if maybe I've got a branch office where I've got some kind of renegade administrators down there that keep making local group policies that we really don't want them to make. Now that could be overridden with a group policy object, but on the other hand, I don't want them to even process those in the first place. So I could set up a group policy object from the domain, which will shoot down to all of those local computers, and it will forcibly disable local group policy on those machines. So that certainly is a possibility. For example, that thing where we just disabled control panel. Maybe I don't really want someone to disable control panel there in that renegade, that renegaded Tucson user's office. So what I could do here is I could create another group policy here from the domain level. Notice that I'm using Group Policy Management Console on the domain level here, and I could say disable local policy processing. Okay. You do want to normally name your group policy objects as specifically as you can. Don't just name it GPO1, GPO2, or whatever, because that gives us no clue as to what's actually in it. There's ways of finding that, but it's much simpler if you just name it the right name in the first place. So then I'm going to right-click on this to choose Edit, and I want to disable the local group policy processing. So I'm going to go up here to Policies, then I'm going to go to Administrative Templates, then I'm going to go down to System, and then go to Policies. Our group policy. There we go. Group policy. Go down here, and I'll go to the standard view so I can see a little bit better here. And I'm then going to go ahead, first of all, and alphabetize this thing. I don't know what the logic is for how they do this. There's actually a unique identifier for each one of these policies, and they're sorted in that order. But normal humans would never figure that out, so we sort this alphabetically on the column here by clicking it. And then I think it's down here under Turn Off. There it is, turn off local group policy objects processing. So now I turn that on, or enable this, okay, and then click OK. Now what we should see happen here is if I go back over to my Windows 8 computer, that it will no longer apply that local policy where it disabled a control panel. All right, now this policy right now is not linked. We're going to be addressing this again later on, but remember, you have to link the policies in order for them to actually have any effect. So I'm going to take this and link it up here to the Tucson desktops. Why? Because that's where the computer account is located. So if I go back over here to Active Directory Users and Computers, Tucson desktops, that's where that Windows 8 computer is located, is underneath that organizational unit. Okay, so once that's been done, now I'm going to go back over to the Windows 8 client, and I'm going to run GP update. I talked to you about that a little bit earlier. And once this policy is done processing, it should reach out and find that I have a new policy up there on the domain controller, and then it should take effect pretty shortly here. So I'm going to go to, let's see, what am I looking for? GP edit? No, control panel, excuse me. Control panel. And now I should be able to click on this without getting a red X. And sure enough, there we have it. Now, why did that work now? Again, to review that, it's because we went on the domain controller and we configured that policy right here where it would disable the local policy processing. We linked it to the Tucson desktops where that computer account is located. So then once we refresh the policy, it took effect. Now we're going to be going back and forth here a little bit because as I look at this control panel, I realize, you know what? Once again, everybody can access this control panel. But there's a lot of things here I really don't want my generic users to be able to access, or I don't want a passerby to be able to access. Maybe again, if it's a kiosk machine. So I really would rather that administrators could access the control panel, but any other logged on account could not. That being the case, I'm going to return back up here to DC Nugget 1. I'm going to go back to this policy, and I'm going to unlink that policy from the Tucson desktops. Okay, so it's link enabled right now. I could either clear that checkbox, or I could just delete this, and I'm going to do that for the time being. Notice that this does not actually delete the policy. See, it still exists right down here. It's just no longer linked to Tucson desktops. Right now, this is kind of a lame duck policy because it might be very powerful settings that are configured in there, but unless I link it to something, it doesn't do anything. All right, so it's pretty much the same as if I had never configured it in the first place right now. And what we should see happen here is if I do a GP update again, then we'll see that I will not be able to open up the control panel again. Now, the problem with that is I'm also logged on right now as an administrator. So if I do a who am I all, then I'll see here, you know what, I'm a local administrator here, and even I can't get to control panel anymore. Let's just confirm that again just one more time real quick here. So if I go into this control panel, see, I'm messed up. So this is not really what I want, because I want my administrators to be able to access control panel to make configuration changes on this kiosk, but not everybody else. So how can I do that using only the local policy? So if I want to make that kind of an exception so that my administrators are not subject to this policy, notice that there's really nothing I can do in this interface. You know, you don't just right-click on it and say override for admins or something like that. It's just not there. So what I'm going to do here instead is you have to kind of know the secret to getting to the proper interface, and that is that you need to create your own MMC console. So I'm going to go to, just type MMC here, and this will give me just a blank console. All right, and then once I'm into this, I need to remove snap-ins by going up to the menu here. Okay, so I'm going to add remove snap-ins. And then down here under Group Policy Items, let's go expand this out a little bit. Group Policy Object Editor, I will click on Add. And then notice that it says Group Policy Object Local Computer. Okay, I'm okay with that. I'm going to leave that one in for now. I'm going to click Finish. But then I'm going to do another one here that will allow me to make exceptions. So I'll click on Browse. Now notice what it does. I can click on another computer if I want to remotely do it, or, in this case, users. So I can say a specific user, like the trainer account, or administrators, or non-administrators. So I'll click on Administrators, click OK, and Finish. And then click OK again. Now notice that I've got a node here where I can say, you know what, for local administrators, anybody that's a member of the local administrators group, we're going to make some changes to their administrative templates so that in their control panel, they do have access to the control panel and PC settings. So how would we override that then? Well, on the one that's already configured, it's set up here where it says enabled. So in other words, it's going to enable this prohibition. But if I disable this prohibition, that's kind of a double negative, okay, which means it's a positive. So I'm not going to prohibit access to control panel settings. okay, for administrators. So now once I click OK, notice there's also no file or save as. Oh, there is, but I could save the console, but it didn't actually save the policies themselves. As soon as I clicked OK, this actually was effective immediately, at least once the policy does refresh. Again, I can forcibly refresh it, and I'm going to do that right now using a GP updates. And then what we should see happen is we should be able to get into the control panel. So I'm logged on as the local administrator account, okay, remember, that's a local administrator. And then if I go into the start item and type a control panel, now we can see that I have full access to it. However, having logged off and logged on as Tucson user 02, we'll see that I do not have access to that control panel anymore. So if I do, first of all, let's do a CMD to confirm that I'm not a member of the local administrators security group. You can see that, sure enough, not a member of administrators. All right. Now if I go back over and try to get back to control panel again, I'm just going to right click down once I get down here, if it lets me. This thing just drives me nuts, Microsoft. Why did you have to do it this way? Anyway, now I'm going to try to get to control panel. Well, sure enough, I'm not able to do it. Why? Because I'm not a member of the administrator's security group. So you can see kind of how the local group policy is useful. You can do it with servers that have specific exceptions. You want them to be administered in a given way. And you could maybe, again, disable control panel for everybody except administrators, which I just demonstrated. Also, it's very useful for non-domain systems. I mean, if I have a computer that maybe is a standalone computer for whatever reason, and those will exist from time to time, and if it's not a member of my domain, then group policy objects in the domain will not flow down to it. So I have to configure local policy for those machines. Also, another thing to identify, just in terms of terminology, is that when we do this thing where we make an exception for administrators, non-administrators, or a specific user there, this is what we call the multiple local group policy. Okay, because in the past we've only had one local group policy. Now we can have the one that we have always had, plus we can add on to that the exceptions for administrators, non-administrators, or user-specific. All right, folks, I got to wrap it up here because I've been informed that it's time for me to do my sit-ups. Apparently, my wife has got some kind of a masterful group policy configured on me. Anyway, let's take a look here at what we covered under Group Policy Part 1. We first of all just took a look at an introduction to group policy objects. Most of that really relates to domain group policy objects. However, we focused a lot of our time here on local group policy because it is part of the exam objectives, and it does have a very useful and targeted purpose. Remember also that we're no longer restricted to a single local group policy. Now we can use multiple local group policy in order to make exceptions for administrators, non-administrators, as well as specific individual accounts. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.